Boy, full house. I see people all the way in the back. I'm Caroline Bowman, director of Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to the 6th lecture in the Enid and Lester Morse Historic Design Lecture Series. Hard to believe it's the 6th lecture, isn't it? The series brings scholars of global stature to Cooper Hewitt to share the latest research on design history from the Renaissance up to the present day, and shed new light on significant works in our extraordinary collection of design objects. This important public program was established in 2011 through a gift from our dedicated trustee, Dinnie Morse, and her husband, Lester. Yay. Their tremendous generosity has allowed us to bring renowned historians such as Jules Stern, Carolyn Sargentson, and Cheryl Buckley to Cooper Hewitt as part of our ongoing commitment to expand Cooper Hewitt's contributions to international design scholarship. Tonight, Reinier Baarsen, Senior Curator of Furniture at Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, will speak to us about the art of marquetry and the collaborations among European cabinet makers of the late 17th century to design and craft these elegant and innovative works of furniture. Cooper Hewitt holds 21 works of marquetry drawings and furniture in its collection, many of which Dr. Baarsen will discuss tonight, and he spent the afternoon in our drawings and prints collection, so all of his observations will be fresh and new, including a magnificent late 17th century cabinet on stand on display in our exhibition, Hewitt Sisters Collect. I am absolutely thrilled that Dr. Baarsen is with us tonight to share his vast knowledge of this remarkable realm of historic design. Dr. Baarsen is among the world's foremost scholars of European furniture and an influential connoisseur who has identified many important pieces over the course of his distinguished career. In addition to serving as curator of the Rijksmuseum, Dr. Baarsen is a visiting professor of the history of decorative arts at Leiden University and the author of numerous scholarly works in the fields of 17th and 18th century furniture and decorative arts. His recent tome, Paris 1650 to 1900, tells the story of more than 200 years of French decorative art through objects in the Rijksmuseum collection. Dr. Baarsen is also a longtime friend of Cooper Hewitt. He generously arranged the lending of works from the Rijksmuseum that very rarely travel for our 2007 exhibition, Pernese as Designer, and our 2008 exhibition, Rococo, The Continuing Curve, as well as contributed a masterful essay to the exhibition's catalog. This morning, as I mentioned, Dr. Baarsen was in our drawings and prints department looking at rare drawings for his upcoming exhibition dedicated to the 17th century phenomenon of the auricular style in the Netherlands and England. The exhibition will take place at the Rijksmuseum in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Reinier Baarsen.
Thank you very much for that very kind, overwhelming introduction. I hope I can live up to the expectations you've created. And thank you very much for inviting me to lecture here tonight in this series. I didn't know about your marquetry drawings, I have to say. So that is something we're going to have to look at tomorrow. And I'm afraid I won't be able to involve. I'm very interested to see what they are, marquetry drawings. That must be a rarity. But what we're going to focus on tonight is this cabinet, which I've long known, which is in your collection, and I've long known it. In fact, I go back here at the museum a bit further because I worked together with Jervis Jackson Stops on the exhibition on courts and colonies, which was in 1989, so you were probably not yet born. But And so, quite excitedly, the people, David McFadden said, well, we've got this cabinet, we think it's Dutch, and it's this cabinet. And it's slightly the bale of any Dutch furniture historian. When something has floral marquetry, flowers, everybody says, oh, it's Dutch, you know, you must come and see it. It's a Dutch piece of furniture. I used to work at the Victoria and Albert Museum for a number of years and went to see a lot of great English houses. And almost inevitably, the owner would say, oh, you're from Holland, that's wonderful. We've got this great piece of furniture, which, in fact, William III gave to one of our ancestors. I sort of knew you got this sinking feeling, and most of the time it was something like this, which is a very curious phenomenon in the history of furniture, because there is a vast quantity of, and in fact yesterday somebody here in the audience showed me a comparable piece that is in a collection of an institution or I think of a club here in New York. And everybody always thinks this is 17th century Dutch floral marquetry. But in fact, what happened is that Holland in the 17th and 18th century was the richest country in the world because of our tremendous trade in the 17th century. But it was a wealth that was already at that time quite evenly distributed, unusually evenly distributed in European terms. In most European countries, there would be a court and then agrarian sort of population, whereas Holland, being a tiny country, really had great trading cities very early on. So there was a very wide population of fairly wealthy people who could afford rather good furniture. And so there is a massive amount of good, plain Dutch veneered furniture, which in the 19th century got exported to a very large extent to England, because the English were then beginning to furnish their houses with antiques, and dealers came over to Holland and bought it at vast quantities of this furniture, which was fairly plain and obviously thought to be too plain by many collectors. And a fashion came into existence to inlay earlier pieces of furniture with so-called old marquetry. And this is an example of that. There are many, many, many examples. This is presumably a late 17th century piece of furniture, which would have been plain and was then inlaid at a later moment. We don't know when that fashion started. I think quite early on, I think probably in the 1840s or something, with 17th century looking furniture, in fact spoiling the piece of furniture, but making it somewhat more lavish. This is another example. You actually see that this is a later piece of furniture, it's sort of late 18th century, with completely incongruous 17th century looking marquetry inlaid. This became so fashionable, rather oddly, that a lot of new pieces then began to be made in England. I'm not sure whether it was happening in Holland as well. Edwards and Roberts were a vast firm in London who were doing this, so you often find pieces like it stamped by Edwards and Roberts. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon which, as the pieces aren't particularly attractive, nobody's really worked on, but it should actually, it is in the history of taste, is quite something. Now, this morning, Sarah Coffin and I were looking at the cabinet here upstairs, and this is not a good photograph. It's a photograph we had to take literally this morning with a telephone practically, but this is part of the stretcher of the cabinet here in the museum. And here you actually see, we will see later on that on the upper register, on the doors and the drawers of the cabinet, the marquetry is of very good quality. But as was usual in the 17th century and in the 18th century to some extent as well, there where the eye was drawn to, the marquetry was of the highest quality, and then on legs or on portions that wouldn't be so visible, the marquetry was less good. There was less money spent, there was less time spent, the materials were less fine. There was always a gradation within a piece of furniture, except for perhaps the very, very grandest things. And this interesting marquetry, which is not particularly distinguished, whereas the cabinet itself has very good marquetry. This is the type of, if you look at the style, for instance, here. Let me see if I can show you that. This kind of endlessly repeated little pattern sort of derives from this kind, this is slightly finer, but derives from this kind of 17th century prototype. As I say, we don't exactly know when this came into fashion, but I think certainly by 1850 it had become quite an established type of marquetry furniture and what everybody called Dutch marquetry. This is a picture by Millet of 1872 of three fashionable sisters in London with antique, surrounded by antique furniture, antique and exotic furniture. And here you see a sort of a card table of a mid-18th century type decorated with this 17th century type marquetry. And well, this is what I'm always being shown as Dutch marquetry furniture. In fact, here is a detail of the cabinet upstairs. Upstairs? Yeah, I suppose upstairs. We now agree that this is an English piece of furniture that is based on a number of details that sort of connoisseurship details that we know. I'm not telling you anything new. It's labeled English in the galleries. This convex upper drawer, the beaded moldings around the drawers, the type of mounts, although Sarah Coffin and I was looking, this is clearly a later mount, and it has undergone certain changes, so you don't always know that you're actually looking at the original. But there are many features in this piece of furniture that clearly mark it out as a late 17th century English piece of furniture. This is another bad photograph, which again we took this morning because I was interested to see, there was no photograph on the website or available to see what was behind the little door. And again, this is a type of simpler marquetry decoration, which you would get when you get inside the cabinet. The decoration becomes slightly less lavish. And although sort of close to what happens in Holland, this is again something that is quite clearly distinguished as an English feature. Now, from a design point of view, this is not a good photograph, but you may remember the configuration of the stand with the 6 legs, which look rather odd and are difficult to arrange. Well, here is a slightly more conventional type, something that people will recognize more easily as English, a seaweed marquetry piece of furniture, but with the same problem about the stand. The 4 legs, the 4 front legs are directed forward, and then these are done. We will see another image of the Cooper Hewitt cabinet later on. These are put a perpendicular, which is actually, it's one way of resolving it. We have a cabinet like this at the Rijksmuseum where we've put all the legs at angles, and there doesn't actually seem to be one successful way of arranging them. You'd think that there would be signs, clear signs, in the furniture itself of how to arrange them, but that actually is not the case. This is a more typically English piece of furniture, and there are comparable pieces in the Royal Collection or at Chatsworth, where through archival evidence it's known that they may have been made by Gerrit Jensen, who is the best known late 17th century English furniture maker, who is of Dutch descent. And so there is a reason for attributing, as we will find out through the talk, there is a reason to attributing floral marquetry to the Dutch, but the story is much more complicated than, oh, it's a tulip, it has to be Dutch. In fact, when we look for sources for floral marquetry in Holland in the earlier 17th century, they are very difficult to find. I will show you during this talk that there is reason to believe that the Dutch were indeed instrumental in spreading floral marquetry throughout Europe, but we miss a phase of Dutch floral marquetry that was made in Holland first, so then the specialization was spread out. This is a much earlier cupboard, done probably around 1637 by Hermann Doomer, who was a German. As the Germans are the furniture makers of Europe, you will very often find, wherever you are, whether you're in Florence or in Paris, or less so in England, or in Amsterdam or in The Hague, the finest cabinet makers will often turn out to be of German descent. And the Germans traveled all over Europe. Germany is full of woods. I mean, that seems a simple explanation, but there must be some reason why the Germans somehow are often distinguished as the greatest, technically speaking, the greatest cabinet makers. And then they move to Paris or they move to Amsterdam and they assimilate the style. We're talking about design here. It's the design history, and it's a very complex story. And I think what I'm going to try and show, talking about floral marquetry throughout the 17th century, are we looking at designerless design? I mean, this is not the sort of craft, this is not a sort of development where you can actually point at a drawing, as you can in your wonderful collection of design drawings, and say, look, this architect or this artist imagined or invented this type of object, this form, this technique. No, it is something that seems to be. There seem to be various layers. There are the layers of people inventing forms, people drawing forms, but just as strong is a tradition in craftsmanship, and craftsmanship that evolves and that is transmitted by traveling people, by workshop practice, which is a much more complex situation than the easy assumption of later periods of a designer shaping something which then gets executed by people who follow the instructions given in a drawing or in a plan. So a German coming to Amsterdam and introducing a new art, really, the art of what we call Eberhardwerker, ebony worker, ébéniste in French. Because from the early 17th century onwards, exotic woods were imported in quantities to Europe by the Dutch primarily through the East Indies Company. I'm telling you something which most of you obviously know very well. The furniture which from the Middle Ages onwards would have been made in one wood, either in oak or in a simpler wood, is now constructed of a wood, and then the wood is hidden by applying another more costly wood, by veneering the core wood with a more costly wood, ebony, very often ebony, typically, because that was the most remarkable new wood, this black, shiny wood, which was like a great innovation brought to a continent used to oak for many, many centuries. So it was a startling new art, and the actual craft was called after the wood workers, ébénistes, people. Traditions coming together in this piece, which are not design traditions merely. They are the traditions of use, they are traditions of symbolism, and, well, this is in a way my point in this entire lecture, that design is perhaps too reductive a phrase to describe the kind of, well, the process by which these innovations and by which the kind of furniture we're talking about comes into being. Sorry, it's now not working. Here you see the inside of the little flap, and in fact this is properly called marquetry. Here we are looking at a mosaic made up from different materials, from ebony, various woods, ivory, and mother of pearl in many, many colors. The shell of a mother of pearl, the shell that mother of pearl comes from, where it's dirtier, it tends to take on more colors, pink, green, blue, etc. And although there is some artificial coloring here, most of it is actually in the nature of the shell itself. And this is, in a way, a first phase of what you might call floral marquetry. Hermann Doomer, he's next door, he's down the road. He was painted by Rembrandt, and this is his portrait, which is at the Metropolitan Museum, which is an incredible rare occurrence for Rembrandt to paint a craftsman and his wife, who is now at the Hermitage. They are the only couple of craftspeople known to have been portrayed by Rembrandt, and although Rembrandt scholars tend to say, look, she's quite plainly dressed, and he clearly looks like, he doesn't look like a grand person. But they completely missed the point, because in fact, what is very extraordinary and very innovative, that in 1640, when Rembrandt was at the height of his power, at the height of his fame, and extremely expensive, there is this romantic story of Rembrandt being very poor and not having enough money. And then, of course, there was a story in the 19th century that Doomer made his frames and he couldn't pay his bills. So in order to do that, he painted his portrait. Well, none of that, because in 1640, Rembrandt was very, very rich. He was a great collector and was highly demanded by everybody. And Hermann Doomer clearly was in a position. He was one of these. He had invented a new art. He was on the level of Rembrandt, like some silversmith at that same point. Rembrandt didn't regard a lesser painter. We have grown accustomed now to seeing painting as a very separate art form, and a secondary painter like Jan van Gooi or somebody like that who paints pretty landscapes. But Rembrandt would, take no notice of somebody like that. He'd think, well, you better come and take some lessons with me. Whereas there were silversmiths or furniture makers, somebody like Hermann Doomer, who was really introducing a new art to Europe. Rembrandt, I'm not making this up. We know from many records, he had a very, very high regard for artists of that calibre, who were working in a different medium from him. So this is a very remarkable early instance of furniture makers being portrayed, in fact, by the greatest artists living and working in the city where they were active. To continue the down the road theme, this is a cabinet attributed to Doomer, which the Metropolitan recently, but after we discovered that all this furniture was made by Doomer, it's not something we've known for a very, very long time, the interest grew larger, and of course it was interesting for the Metropolitan, who have the portrait, to try and acquire a piece of furniture by him. Now this is more typically even than the cupboard I was showing you. This is actually coming from an earlier tradition more strongly, because if you imagine the doors shut, you're looking at an undistinguished black cabinet that doesn't tell you anything about the surprises that are inside. That's very much a sort of Renaissance, or if you will, mannerist way of thinking. The surprises come, the knowledge of the piece comes as you slowly discover it, as you open it up, as you open the drawers which may contain works of art. You need to make a voyage of discovery to understand the actual worth of the piece of furniture. And in some very complex pieces, there are actually descriptions of the contents and what they were meant to teach you. Here, a slightly later piece by Dirk van Rijswijk, who was an artist, another distinguished artist in Amsterdam, who inlaid stone panels of black stone with, again, this kind of marquetry of mother of pearl, which again were perceived as wonders by the public of the time. Van Rijswijk never sold this tabletop, which is huge and must have cost a fortune to produce. So these were not, Doomer in fact also kept that great cupboard I showed you in his shop. He never sold it, and it descended in his family until 1738. And this piece again was mentioned as a wonder by guides of Amsterdam, and when the Grand Duke of Tuscany came to Amsterdam, he made a point to go and see Dirk van Rijswijk and see this tabletop. And Joost van den Vondel, who is our greatest poet at that time, wrote a poem on it, comparing it favorably to painting, because he says this is nature painting with the materials of nature itself, and it cannot perish. It's a kind of painting that cannot perish, like the colors that oil paint or everything, they will be different in 100 years' time or in 200 years' time. But this is like a kind of permanent painting, and he then compares the artist to God himself, who uses the materials given by the creation and puts himself in the shoes, so to speak, of the creator, in homage, actually, to God and the world he has created. In homage makes something, trying to make the most of the materials that can be found in the world. Of course, materials, but that's a different story. I'm not going to go into materials, but they distinguish. Ébéniste. I was telling you about ebony workers, ébéniste in Paris. Very often, again, not Frenchmen, the first generation, the first two generations, very often either Dutch or again, German. Also work, but here you have ebony proper. Now, there is a lot of decoration on the outside, and yet this piece will only really tell you of its secrets when you open it up. Very typically French is that the piece as a whole is conceived as a piece of architecture. So the cabinet and its stand are, and here we are approaching design. They are conceived as a piece of architecture. And there's a famous drawing in Oxford which shows a comparable cabinet. So here, yes, there must have been an architect perhaps involved in evolving this type of furniture, but then the craftsmen take over. And although this is already quite in a way a Baroque piece of furniture, because, you know, if you see this shut in a palace or in a house that you visit, you're very impressed. And there's a lot for you to look at. There's the beautiful proportion of the piece as a whole. There's the design, so to speak. Then there's the execution with a great many carved stories and carved ornaments, so you can enjoy it for a long time, like you could a painting hanging on the wall, discuss it and marvel at it. But then if you knew the owner, or if the owner really wants to distinguish you, he comes with his key and he opens it up. And there are various layers, so it's a much more private work of art. That's why the decorative arts have a hard time, in a way, in museums, because a picture on the wall and you standing in front of it, your relationship with the work of art is more or less the same as it would have been in the time it was made. Whereas with the decorative arts, they're always meant to be handled, turned around, regarded under various lights, which is why it's so good that there are places like the Cooper Hewitt Museum who take the trouble to draw people's attention to these works of art, that in a way need more explanation, but then I think often are much more rewarding. So here still, in this great piece that is already part of a palace architecture, in that sense, like the Doomer cabinet, it's a hybrid piece of furniture, because it's an art cabinet at the same time, and you actually have to open it up to admire its intricacies. And then marquetry, that new art, which is not visible on the outside, is visible inside. This may actually have been made by a Dutchman, by Peter Gole, who went to Paris and became a famous craftsman there. And this very extraordinary attenuated style, rather akin to the auricular style, which you mentioned that we're preparing an exhibition on, is also displayed on the outside of this piece of furniture, which may also be by Gole or maybe by somebody else. And here, a big change taking place. All of a sudden, what you see is what you get. The piece of furniture, and that's a very Baroque, essentially Baroque feature. The piece of furniture is made, and this is actually rather a private piece, we'll see other pieces where it's more strongly the case, is made to be part of an interior that overwhelms you when you come in. That is expression of the power, of the majesty, of the wealth, of the position of the person you're visiting. And you're not to have the time to open it up. You don't get somebody who privately shows you what's inside. You're not penetrating into secret after secret after secret. suddenly the furniture is much more conceived. Well, it's not that sudden, but it's going on throughout the 17th century as part of a grand interior, as one of the arts that contribute together with architecture, sculpture, painting to create a tout ensemble, a Gesamtkunstwerk, it's a slightly anachronistic use of the term, but which really dominates all of 18th century art to create spaces that, with all the elements in them, overwhelm you, make an impression, whether it's a church or a palace interior, that immediately, like a theater, overwhelm the visitor. And this slightly humble work of art, I mean, these marquetry pieces are very much part of that. This is a piece very close to the one we saw before in style, but now again made in Holland, surprisingly. When we bought this not so long ago for the Rijksmuseum, and at first I thought it must have been made in Paris, although it's very clearly made for a Dutch patron, for Amalia van Solms, who was the wife, well, at the time the cabinet was made, she was the widow of Stadtholder Frederick Henry, and she lived as a widow at Paleis Noordeinde, which is now the palace, the working palace of our king. And here, as a widow, she held court. It's a complicated story, but her son died quite early, and then the States General in Holland said, we won't have another stadtholder. So for a while, we didn't have a stadtholder, although Amalia van Solms, who was still there, had a grandson, and she completely devoted all her energy to creating a situation where that grandson would be stadtholder again, which in fact happened 22 years after her son died. But this is a piece, if you open it up, it has her monogram, and so it's a sort of piece that, well, this is Baroque in a complicated way, again, a transitional thing. And then we found a poem, actually, where this piece is described in great detail. And the symbolism of the doors is explained. I'll very briefly tell you about it, but this is actually the orange tree. Look, these are small oranges. This is the tree of orange, which will triumph. It's now contained by its enemies, but in fact there are already breaks, and the enemies, the snake and the monster, are destroying each other. And so orange will be triumphant, and here the pelican in its piety, the pelican open, sort of stabbing its own breast in order to feed its young with its blood, an image of Christ, but also an image of a good leader. So there's a whole poem to explain the symbolism of this piece of furniture, which was like a rebus, because Amalia van Solms couldn't actually very proudly proclaim what she was hoping to achieve. It was politically rather tricky. But actually, that's not what I want to tell you about, really. The poem also says that the piece was made in The Hague by a Dutchman who looked after Amalia's palaces for her. Well, it's so French-looking. He must have come back the day before from Paris. But of course that happened all the time. There was constant communication between the countries. And now here, as the symbolism is so complicated, we are looking at a design. It was probably done by Peter Post, the main architect for Amalia van Solms, because it's such a complex story that it's not to be imagined that a cabinet maker could himself evolve a pattern of such complexity. Perhaps he could evolve a pattern of such ornamental complexity, but not of such symbolic complexity. So again, various strands coming together. Back to France, and this is Pierre Gaulle again, this Dutchman who was born in Bergen, went to work with his, well, later became his father-in-law, a Dutchman who had a cabinet-making shop in Paris, which was called à la Ville d'Amsterdam, in the city of Amsterdam. So at that time, it was still a good thing, an advertisement to say in Paris, I'm from Amsterdam. About 50 years later, the French had completely conquered the world of the decorative arts, and the Dutch cabinet makers then started to call their shops in the commode of Paris. But at this time, it was still, one knew that the actual craftsmanship came from Holland, and Pierre Gaulle went to Paris, early on becomes ébéniste du roi of the young Louis XIV, but we don't actually know what he was doing in the early 1650s. This is a piece he made for the brother of the king on an ivory ground, very like that piece I showed you before with ivory and of mother of pearl. And look, here we've got floral marquetry. And we think, well, there is reason to believe Pierre Gaulle made things in the 1650s for Cardinal Mazarin, the minister of Louis XIV, and they are certainly the earliest mentions of floral marquetry furniture. And it's this in Paris, and it's this sort of mystery that here we see the piece with the door open. But again, you see that Baroque, it's rather a modest piece of furniture, but incredibly elegant. But you see that what is inside, okay, there is something inside, but it's not the essence. The essence is outside. And actually, you might be slightly disappointed opening this up, but oh, no more ivory, we're looking at ebony now. So it's the outside that is the important feature. That's that very Baroque element. And here another cabinet, which is at the Rijksmuseum, certainly also by Hall, probably slightly earlier, about 1655. Here is an ivory veneered cabinet made in Augsburg, which is also in the Rijksmuseum of the 1660s, and it's set with panels of pietra dura, panels composed of semi-precious stones, which were made in Florence. They were a specialty of the Florentine workshops, the Grand Ducal workshops. I'm showing you a detail here, which excelled in choosing stone in such a way that the actual pattern of the flowers was suggested by the propensity of the stone. So this kind of shadowing, none of that is added, all of that is chosen from the stone itself. And this is probably the actual source for Gaulle's, well, let's go back, for Gaulle's floral marquetry, because really he is using wood as a mosaic of stones. Probably the actual, so again, another strand, probably the actual inspiration. We know Mazarin had a lot of pietra dura furniture, Mazarin, who was Italian himself. So the actual inspiration may have come from, not so much from Holland, but from these Italian examples. Again, down the road, a wonderful table by Gaulle, where one sees what the French do at this point. They somehow define, they make the definitive version of whatever you're talking about, whether you're talking about a table, whether you're talking about a cabinet, whether you're talking about a piece of silver. This is this extraordinary revolution under Louis XIV that the French suddenly absorbing from Holland, from Germany, from Italy, from everywhere, craftsmen, types of craftsmanship, elements of design, but they refine it and they come up with solutions that somehow are then perceived by everybody as classical and copied all over Europe. And that's something that's really going to go on for about 150 years until the end of the 18th century. Here at the top, again, you can see how close this is, in a way, to pietra dura work. This could almost be executed in various hard stones. Now, we see that inspiration comes from Italy to France, but curiously, floral marquetry is also done in Florence from the 1660s onwards. This is a cabinet in the Uffizi, and this is a tabletop by the same man, again by a Dutchman, Leonardo van der Vinne. So we've got Leonardo van der Vinne going to Florence. We've got Pieter Gole going to Paris. And we've got Gerrit Jensen, I mentioned him before in connection with the seaweed marquetry cabinet, going to London in the 1660s, 1670s, and they introduced floral marquetry all over Europe. This is a piece, this is a table at Ham House, the famous house outside London, which was between 1672 and 1683, completely redone for the Duke and Duchess of Lauderdale. And although a huge amount of work has been done on that house, we recently did a new book on it, and I wrote on the furniture. And it's now, I think we have more access to the archives, although it is surprising because they had been looked at before. But if you look at them carefully, there's absolutely no doubt there's only one person who's called a cabinet maker, which is an ébéniste, which is an Ebbenhoutwerker, so somebody making veneered furniture, and getting sums like £100 or £200, whereas the joiners get £4, £5, whatever. There is absolutely no doubt that all the marquetry furniture made in the 1670s for Ham House is the earliest recorded work by Gerrit Jensen. Here is a tabletop. Now, it's okay, but if you compare it to Gaulle, it's actually quite plain and quite simple, and we're slowly approaching the Cooper Hewitt cabinet. You think, has he completely forgotten about it? But I'm trying to work up into that. But if you look at this funny figure here, it's quite alive. It's very well done. It's very effective, but it doesn't have the same classic quality of the furniture made in France at the time. Here, another table, a slightly plainer one, which must also be by Jensen in its historic setting. Of course, that is rather wonderful. That's very wonderful at Ham House, that you actually see the pieces where they were intended to be. And Sarah, look, I mean, we do have these cushions, because Sarah Coffin and I were looking at the cabinet upstairs and wondering what possibly could have been added and what could have been redone. But in fact, now looking at this one here, we were slightly doubtful about those little blocks on the cabinet upstairs. But here they are on the Jensen table. And a Jensen mirror, also at Ham House, and even a pair of bellows inlaid with floral marquetry, doubtless by him. But, as I said, the quality impulse comes from France by this time. So the next step in refinement of floral marquetry again comes from France in the work of André-Charles Boulle, the great successor to Pierre Gaulle, the greatest furniture maker perhaps who ever lived, the most famous one certainly, the one whose name has never gone out of fashion. And his real contribution lies in different fields, in the integration of gilt bronze and marquetry furniture on gilt bronze mounts, and the invention of many new forms. This is quite an early piece by him, a great armoire, which is now in the Louvre. And you see the floral marquetry obtains a completely new level of marquetry, of quality. It's like painting in wood, in this case on a base of tortoiseshell, but using the woods in a very painterly, very free manner that had not been matched by anybody before. And this kind of, well, there's actually quite a closeness if you look at these flowers here to the Cooper Hewitt cabinet, and also to Dutch floral marquetry that we're now beginning to recognize. This is a cabinet by the best-known maker of the late 17th century of floral marquetry furniture in Amsterdam, called Jan van Meekeren, a Dutchman, totally Dutch background, Dutch type of furniture, very little adornment, no gilt bronze mounts the way you did see them on the French piece, but the actual floral marquetry, the actual idea even of a vase of flowers on the side of a table, and the way it's depicted very realistically with this great abundance of different flowers, is clearly inspired by France, is clearly inspired by the model of André-Charles Boulle, possibly through engravings by somebody like Monnoyer, but not necessarily. Again, craftsmanship, again, atelier, furniture makers traveling from one country to another may have played a bigger role than this actual design that you can point at as a design. That makes it so easy. It's in the libraries. So if you find it somewhere, you can say, oh, look, this is Monet. It's probably after him. But it's much more, they are much more part of a larger movement that is expressed in various media, I think, at the same time. Because look at this panel by Dirk van Rijswijk, dated 1654, which is in Dresden, and now in the exhibition in Amsterdam. It's his largest panel. And it's very like Van Meeker and Door. So I think people were thinking the same kind of thing at the same time in various media. Here, another cabinet of another group, probably also by an Amsterdam maker. We think not Van Meeker. There were quite a lot of furniture makers we know concentrating on floral marquetry furniture. And this is actually very similar in its detailing to the cabinet here at Cooper Hewitt. In fact, a restorer was finding flowers on your cabinet that he finds in exactly the same form on cabinets that are by this Dutch maker. Now that may mean that they simply sent flowers across the channel. We know that that happened later on. We know that people sent marquetry to another country, or somebody in Paris sent marquetry to his brother in Marseille who was making marquetry furniture. Van Meeker, we discovered in 1684, worked for a year in London. It's a very international moment. And what we haven't found, and that's in a way a sort of mystery, is here the side of the cabinet at the Rijksmuseum by this maker, whose name we don't know, but who is close, very close, to what you find on the Cooper Hewitt cabinet. Here is a door of your cabinet. It's almost as if you're looking at the same man. Now, of course, what the English do when something is very high quality, they say immigrant craftsman, because they feel we can't have done that ourselves. It's either a Huguenot, or before that it must be a Dutchman. Well, we don't know. It may well be that there was an Englishman who came and trained in Holland. William and Mary were joined king and, well, after 1689, they were joined king and queen of England and stadtholder and the wife of the stadtholder in Holland. We know that they had craftsmen traveling from London to The Hague and Amsterdam all the time. But what is interesting is that this is clearly higher quality than the marquetry that we find on Gerrit Jensen furniture, on this identifiable group of English floral marquetry furniture from this most famous maker. And here we are, I think, one generation on. I would date this cabinet around 1700. We've done a lot of dendrochronology on, which is dating the furniture by the structure of the oak on the marquetry furniture in Holland, and the cabinet with us, that is this one here, dates from between 1690 and 1705. You can date it on the felling of the wood. So I think your cabinet, the cabinet here, is probably that same sort of moment. And here is this is a side, well, really very, very like the side of that Amsterdam cabinet with us. Here, the drawers again. And as I say, some of these flowers are found in identical pattern. You can take a drawing, put the drawing on tracing paper, put the drawing on a flower, on a Dutch piece of furniture, and it's the identical one. But I think flowers were sent across the channel. So again, here we're not talking about design. Here we're talking about the organization of craft, in a way, the trade. This is another cabinet on a Dutch stand, curiously, which doesn't actually belong, which was recently restored in Holland, clearly by the same man. Look, it's very, very similar. So I think we're actually looking, and Sarah Coffin knows of another example in, I think, Copenhagen or Oslo, which is again clearly by the same man. So we're looking at an important English workshop. Sorry, this is not a good slide, but this is this piece that was being restored in Amsterdam recently. And of course, his idea, he takes design, no, he really imitates Japanese lacquer cabinets. The idea of doors opening to an interior, which we don't have in Holland in that way, to an interior filled with drawers, comes to complicate matters from Japan. The shape, in a way, comes from Japan. The technique comes from Holland, but probably the man executing it may well be an Englishman. Here, a design for a cabinet of that same moment by Jean Lepôtre in Paris. And I think you'll probably agree that what we were looking at, that kind of furniture, and this is my last slide, you'll be happy to hear. And here you see that very funny arrangement of the leg. You see it very clearly. Those back legs. I don't think this can be the right arrangement. I don't know how it would have been, but this is not satisfactory somehow. And but as you can see, it's a very different thing from an architecturally conceived piece of furniture, thought in one go, invented in one go by a designer working on paper. And that's what's so great about your collection here. You can confront these designs on paper with what then actually comes out in practice, which I hope to raise a few questions. I think is the result of a very complicated history involving many countries, many crafts, and a lot of inspiration from many sides. Thank you very much.
So I think we're going to take a few questions if anyone had any. Before you start speaking, let me turn down the volume just to sure.
There are Dutch marquetry cabinets that have panels of glass in them so that porcelain can be displayed. How do they fit in? I believe these are earlier, but can you tell us something about how they fit in?
I'm afraid that on the whole they would fit in with the story I started off with the story of, well, everybody wanted a porcelain cabinet, a display cabinet, which is a rare form in the 18th century in Holland. So what you get often is that cabinets have their doors changed in order to have glass in them. I don't think, well, I know of one marquetry, what we call porcelain cast, so glass cabinet to show China of the 1760s, which is a very exceptional silver-mounted piece. But I think the ones we normally see are part of that 19th century story of either an 18th century existing piece enriched with floral marquetry or something made in the 19th century. And there are many about, so you may well have seen one of those.
If you want to stand up.
Sure. Thank you very much. I just had a quick question. We see a lot of these cabinets within the domestic sphere, especially within Holland and in Paris and in France. Just had a question about how much did royal patronage also play into this cabinet making and in bringing these craftspeople to the Parisian area?
Well, royal patronage plays a role, certainly. I mean, Pierre Gaulle worked for Louis XIV. In Holland, marquetry furniture doesn't seem, we find very little marquetry furniture at the court of Stadtholder William III. He has gilded pieces mainly. And so by that time, you begin to get a sense that marquetry furniture is possibly not really royal so much. Louis XIV had later on, I mean, Louis XIV lives forever, so it's confusing to talk about Louis XIV's style because 1660 is a very different moment from 1715 when he dies. But later on, Louis XIV furnishes Versailles essentially with silver furniture, which he then has to melt down and replaces with gilt wooden furniture. So veneered wooden furniture is a slightly lesser layer, has a slightly different status, and it's actually often not really royal furniture. It does become that later on. I mean, Louis XV, obviously, and the Régents, even with Crescent, they have marquetry furniture. But marquetry furniture, royal marquetry furniture at the time of Louis XIV is buhl furniture, which is not wooden furniture, but tortoiseshell and brass inlaid. So I think in the hierarchy of materials, wood is clearly something fairly modest. So the early history, and as you see, the piece made for the brother of the king has an ivory ground. So they are in that early phase still attuned to a sort of Schatzkammer attitude of wanting to have really costly materials. So again, it's a difficult question. I think certainly the early Gaulle furniture is made for Cardinal Mazarin and is made for Louis XIV. But as you see, they are modest pieces. They are small, modest pieces which may play a role in an intimate cabinet room. But the great palace interiors, marquetry furniture doesn't very much play a role.
You talk about the legs, and you talk about the legs, perhaps not sure how some of them were intended to be situated.
Yes.
Were they taken apart early on, and were parts of some of the furniture like this one here intended to be taken apart in pieces to be moved to a different house or up and down stairways?
Well, I don't think they would. I mean, they don't come apart that easily that they were actually intended to be taken apart in order to move them. But the way the legs are attached doesn't actually, there's no fixed manner in which the leg will fit, because it has a sort of screw with which it, or a peg with which it fits into the superstructure and into the stretcher. So you can actually turn it. You can turn. There is no actual indication how it should be assembled. And of course, everything always gets restored. I mean, Sarah Coffin and I were looking at this morning. The big drawer of this cabinet was in the 19th century, refigured to become a writing desk. And probably at that time it was raised slightly. The ball feet may have been replaced at that time. We were looking at these. We weren't sure about them, but I'm looking at the table just now. I mean, that does seem to be the way they were constructed, but these ball feet certainly are later. So it may have been raised slightly. And now, of course, it's standing on casters, which it wouldn't normally, and obviously. But it sort of means you move them about. And when at the back of these now, there's a sort of raised, this is going into a lot of detail, but there's a raised element which we concluded has to be later and was probably put in to protect it when it was being wheeled about. You know, once you have something on casters, it becomes more movable. But it's a very odd and slightly awkward shape, and there is no satisfactory way to arrange these legs, which is very odd.
So I think we just have
Very
time for
English.
one more question.
Thank you very much. The museum library has a copy of a book by Jan Christian Sepp with hand-colored wood samples from 1753.
Yes.
And then it shows wood from all over the world, colonies and exploration. And I'm wondering, at this period in the late 17th century, were these mostly native woods, European native woods, or were they coming from all over the world?
They were coming from all over the world, but for instance with Van Meekeren, and I haven't investigated this piece of furniture carefully, but usually the vast majority of wood used for this slightly later marquetry furniture, late 17th century marquetry furniture, is indigenous, is European. It's not, they don't use that much exotic woods, that many exotic woods, surprisingly in a way, but And they, of course, they color them. You know, they are artificially colored to get a more naturalistic effect.